So recently I made an announcement about CBCS announcing the release of its population database or its census, however you want to look at it. And during that live stream in which I was making that announcement, someone asked me a provocative question. And it was a question about whether this database would somehow impact the value of comics, either positively or negatively. And to be honest with you, I don't remember what my answer was during that live stream. I really don't remember. But post that live stream, I spent some time kind of thinking about that. And there was a little panic, to be honest, that kind of rippled through me as I thought about what could be one of the potential downsides associated with CBCS making this data available. And over the course of this video, I want to spend just a little bit of time talking about some of my thoughts and also sharing some figures with you. If you're curious about what I'm talking about, stay tuned for the video. Reggie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector, and I want to welcome you to another one of my videos. In this video, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the panic that ripped through me as I thought about the CBCS database that was recently made publicly available. And I can tell you for a long time, people have been asking about this. When is CBCS going to get a database? When are they going to make census numbers available to us? People have been asking for this, and CBCS responded, right? But there is oftentimes some potential unintended consequences associated with actions that we ask people to take. And so with them releasing this data, I wanted to think about both the good and the bad. And we may continue to kind of explore the pros and cons of this over a couple of different videos. We'll see how people take to this video. But one of the things that I definitely thought about was that if you potentially have a comic that is valuable based upon its rarity, that having some census data be publicly available that could put that rarity into dispute could have a negative impact on the value of that comic. Put another way, if there are two of something, those two things will be pretty expensive because there are only two of them. But if there are suddenly 2,000 of those things, then they are no longer as valuable because they are no longer rare. And so part of it is we had the CGC database, which provides us with a slice of the pie. And now with the CBCS database, we have an additional slice in that pie. And the question is, how big was that slice? How big or how small is that slice? And I think we've all known that CGC is definitely the recognized leader, having graded, I think it's like 6 million collectibles, right? We don't really have, up until this point, any idea how large or how small the CBCS database is. So what I tried to do was to do a little spot checking. I did a little spot checking to see whether some books that we kind of think about as being rare or expensive, trying to figure out whether those books could potentially see some negative declines as a result of the added slice of the overall pie. And so what I want to do with you in this video is to basically share, I think it's about 8 books that again, just a spot check. I think a more in-depth analysis needs to be done, but I just wanted to do a little bit of a spot check just to kind of test a couple of theories, to play around with the CBCS database and to kind of see what I could find in there. And I think it's to be determined, again, because this is just a small sampling, what the true ramifications could be. But maybe this video will either inspire others out there to do a deeper dive or maybe motivate me to spend some more time doing a deeper dive myself. But with all of that kind of said, I wanted to run through what I've done. I have essentially identified, as I mentioned, about 8 different books from some really blue chip keys, all the way down to some more modern type of keys that are pretty common. And I basically pulled data from the CGC database, and I pulled data from the CBCS database, and then I did a little bit of some crunching to kind of see what the impact of this thing might be. But here is what I did. I first looked at Action Comics #1, and what I saw in the CGC database is that there are only 72 of the Action Comics #1 in the registry. When I looked at CBCS, again, not knowing what I was going to find, I was actually somewhat surprised, maybe pleasantly, maybe unpleasantly, I don't know, to find that there were only 4 copies of Action Comics #1 in the CBCS database. And combined, that is basically 76 total copies that are graded out there with 2 of the largest third-party grading companies that are there. And of that total, CBCS basically has 5.3% of the overall total. So a relatively tiny increase in the overall number of Action Comics #1 that are out there. And I didn't do, restore versus non-restore, blue label, or any other kind of stuff. I just looked at pure totals and did a little bit of some number manipulation to, again, determine that it was only 5.3% of CBCS of the overall total. So we looked first at Superman, then I wanted to go ahead and look at Batman. So I looked at Batman #1, and I saw here that there were 270 copies of Batman #1 within the CGC database, and there were 37 in the CBCS database for a total of 307, and that's basically about 12% of the overall total. So again, CBCS, relatively small number of the total number out there, and their absolute number at 37 is relatively small compared to the 270 that are with CGC. I looked at Detective Comics #27 as well in CGC, and these numbers are maybe a little bit closer, not too close to be honest. CGC had 69 in their database. CBCS had 11 for a total of 80, and the percent of CBCS of the overall was about 13.75%. And I should also mention, I'm going to give a huge shout out to Jess Pele, who actually did a little bit of some checking for me on some of these numbers, and I'll explain why I actually did that in just a moment. But again, a relatively small number of books contained in the CBCS database versus that of CGC. I also, to kind of round out the trifecta, if you will, of DC, I looked at All-Star Comics #8, the first appearance of Wonder Woman. And what I found here was that CGC had 178 copies of this in their database versus only 23 in CBCS for a total of 201. Or about 11.4%. So only about 11.4% of the overall total was CBCS. Again, relatively small numbers. And I was somewhat pleasantly surprised to see that these numbers were small overall. Because again of everything that I've said about CGC being the market leader, people claiming that CGC books can actually bring in more value. I think I've heard as much as 5 to 10% is what people have said to me consistently, that a CGC book will command over a CBCS book. I have not looked at that analysis or that data, but other people have made those claims. I have no reason to dispute it until I actually take some time to do it myself. But these are the numbers that I've heard floated out there. So again, I kind of looked at some some really respectable blue chip comics, at least as it relates to DC. And again, just a little bit of a spot check here. So the next thing that I wanted to try to do was to maybe look at some additional keys, some Marvel keys, maybe some more common books that your average person, if you will, can actually get their hands on. So I looked at Giant Size X-Men #1, and the numbers here are a little different. There were 9,163 copies of Giant Size X-Men #1 on the CGC census, 648 additional books in the CBCS database. Again, that's a relatively big number from everything that we've seen thus far, 648. And that number actually represents about 6.6% of the overall total, which was 9,811 copies between the two databases. There's another book here that to some degree or another defies logic in the sense of the total number of copies of this book that actually exist and the prices that this book commands. And it is none other than Hulk 181. We all know the values of this book, and we all know that this is not necessarily a rare book. In fact, when you look at the CGC database, there are more than 13,000 copies of Hulk 181 on the census. And so my question was, or my thought was, how many more copies of Hulk 181 could actually be out there? And it was maybe a little bit smaller than I thought. I mean, it's a big number, but smaller, right, than it potentially could have been. 862 additional copies of Hulk 181 in the CBCS database for a total of 13,979 copies, and CBCS represents about 6.16% of the overall total. A couple of more books here because I wanted to go even more modern. So I looked at the first appearance of Gambit, X-Men 266. There are 13,000 copies. Specifically 13,980 copies of the first appearance of Gambit in the CGC database, but only, and I use that term loosely, only 712 additional copies are CBCS for a total of 14,692 copies, or about 13.75%. So again, even with these more modern books, these more affordable books, the numbers are still a little small, which again may not necessarily be a bad thing, right? Because again, if we saw similar numbers in the CBCS database that we are seeing in the CGC database, that I think could have a detrimental effect on the value of these comics, right? Theoretically, if there is more supply, out there, then you potentially could have a lower price for these books. I also looked at Amazing Spider-Man #300, book that many people love, and by no surprise with this one, there were 22,191 copies of this book on the census, which 22,191 copies. So how many are on CBCS? 821 copies for a total of 23,000 books, and that represents the CBCS represents 3.56% of the overall total. So again, just some interesting stuff here. It's only a handful of books. I think again to really understand what could happen, a larger sample size could be needed. But essentially what we are seeing here is that we have probably seen with the CGC database the largest slice of the graded pie. We've seen that. We have an additional slice of the overall pie represented by CBCS. And I think just based upon this spot check, that additional slice is relatively small versus CGC. There are other third-party grading companies out there that are all smaller than the aforementioned, which means that their slice of the pie will probably be even smaller, especially if you're talking about some of those higher-end blue chip comics. Maybe they will have some of those lower books, like maybe the Hulk 181s, your ASMs, your Uncanny X-Men 266. I think we will see more of those books that are in those third-party grading services. But to be honest, the largest slice of the pie is really the unknown. It is basically those books that are raw and or potentially just unknown. We don't know if they are still in existence. They could have been destroyed. So that largest slice of the pie is really the raw / unknown, right? Because they print a lot, but a lot of those books could have gone into the dumpster over the years when people have gone away to college, and all of that other stuff, floods and fires and all of these other disasters could have taken a lot of those books off the playing field, but we honestly don't know that for a fact. A few minutes ago, I mentioned Just Pele. I mentioned him because he is a comic shop owner that was in the live stream in which I was talking about the CBCS census data. He made some really smart comments in that live stream. He and I had an offline conversation, and I wanted him to do a little bit of spot checking for me, because what I was finding was that there were some errors, if you will, with the CBCS database. This is a new database. I think that they're still working out some of the kinks. There were numbers in there that I was seeing that did not make sense to me, and so I wanted another person to take a look at it. Just Pele was gracious enough to take me up on my offer. He looked at these same books and came up with slightly different totals, which allowed me to go back and to look at things a little bit differently. So a couple of examples here that I want to cite for you where there were some differences, and they were meaningful differences, not just user error. What I realized is that if you search, for example, for All-Star Comics without a dash, you get a different result than if you search for All-Star Comics. You actually get two different set of results when you do that. And when you do search for the proper All-Star Comics, you actually get some conflicting results in that you get some books that have dates associated with publication dates, and you get another set of books that don't actually have publication dates. And so again, you have a couple of different ways that you can search and get different results, or if you search the right way, you still get some conflicting data. And so again, that's part of the reason why I wanted to have some eyeballs on it. I've actually reported this error to CBCS, and my hope is that they will actually take a look at it. So by the time you see this video, maybe this issue will have resolved itself. The other thing that I really liked, honestly, about the CBCS database is that they did a breakout for newsstand versus direct, because that is one of the questions people oftentimes have is it newsstand, is it direct? They don't want to necessarily see things rolled up or collapsed into one entry. But what was conflicting about the CBCS database is that they would have a total number not identify as newsstand or direct, and then they would have additional lines that would be newsstand or direct, and sometimes some that were also smaller numbers not identified as either newsstand or direct. Again, 5 entries when there should have technically only been 2 that added up to a third. And so just some interesting things happening with the data, and I think it's honestly the fact that CBCS needs to just clean up their database just a little bit. But I mention these things not necessarily to criticize CBCS, but to simply say that if you are looking at this data and something doesn't look right, you may want to try a couple of different searches. You may not want to just do one search and just run with what you see. You may want to take some time to ask some questions and to think about what you're seeing to make sure that it makes sense, especially if you're making some purchasing or selling decisions based upon census data. And I've actually released a couple of videos talking about with the CGC database, there are some caveats that people should be aware of. And so again, these are all cautionary things that I want to throw out there for people to actually think about. So with that, I'm actually going to wrap this video up. If you have any questions about scarcity and rarity, I actually do have a video here on the channel that will go into some of that by detail, which is part of the reason why I wanted to create this video, because rarity is a real thing and it is a factor that affects the value of comics that are out there. And then I also have the video that I mentioned on the caveats associated with the CGC database. So just 2 additional videos that you may want to take a look at just so that you can be more informed. With that said, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope that you found it informative, maybe even entertaining. If you need to reach out to me, feel free to do so on Instagram at Regie Collects, or you can send me an email to reggie@regiecollects.com. Take care.